Hey guys, this is Tech Howdy. I welcome you to another video tutorial where we are building this ASP.NET Core 3 application with Angular 10. In this part of the video tutorial, we will continue working on the login component. In the last video tutorial, we finished the refresh token method in the ASP.NET Core application. So we have finished coding the refresh token method in our auth service. We also implemented the additional logic that is required inside the auth method when we receive the token. And I explained to you guys that we will implement two-factor authentication in a different video tutorial since we don't want to mix login and two-factor authentication at the same time. So now we have finished this auth method, and we can now go ahead and go to our login component in our Angular application and start working on fixing these errors and then consuming our API endpoint. So let's go ahead and fix this error. This error is caused due to the form element in our application, and here we have to specify our form group and the form control names that we are using. So let's go ahead to our login component.ts and then instantiate the required objects that we need in the constructor, as well as we will initialize the values for our form controls in the ngOnIt method as we did for the registration component. So let's go ahead and fix this. So guys, here as you can see, I have instantiated some additional properties. So you will see that I have created a insert form, which is a type of form group object, and the additional form controls that we are going to use in our form, like the username, password, and the remember me flag, which can be checked off and on when the user is logging in. We have a return URL, which is a string, which means that if a user is trying to access a protected section in our application, for example, the user is trying to access the profile page, but they are not logged in. So we will redirect the user to the login page. Once the user has logged in, we will return the user back to the profile page. So initially where the user wanted to go, we will redirect the user to that protected page in after the user has logged in successfully. Error message, as it is pretty obvious, is used for displaying error messages. Invalid login is a Boolean flag that we use to set or to get the login uh, uh, of the user, whether to set it valid or invalid. We will use this. And we have a behavior subject that we are going to use. Here you can see its login status. Now I have used behavior subject over here instead of subject. It's a type of observable, and if you want more details on observable, I will recommend you to read over RxJS, the documentation, because it's a very vast subject which I'm not going to cover in this particular tutorial. But to give you a short intro, instead of using subject, I will be using behavior subject here, because with the advantage of behavior subject is, first, we can multicast its value, which means anyone who's subscribed to this subject value will get the value. Anyone who is subscribed will always get the latest value. So the advantage of behavior subject is that every time it will uh, emit the last value. So you change the value, anyone who subscribed to this object or this variable will get the latest value. And the most important advantage of behavior subject is that we can initialize its value, whereas in subject we cannot initialize it, which means, as you can see over here, I have set the initial value to null. If I use a subject, I cannot initialize the value, therefore I am using a behavior subject here. So there is a lot of differences in different types of observables, and I recommend you to read the documentation on RxJS, because these RxJS very objects help you to manage the state in your application very easily, and it's very good knowledge to have as a Angular developer. So here we are using behavior subject, as I said, and I've created a login status variable over here, which we will be using to manage the login status of the user. Our constructor, we are going to instantiate certain objects in our constructor. So let's go ahead and instantiate those objects. So here in the constructor, we are going to instantiate the account service, because we are going to create the communication to our endpoint. the extension methods over here to log in. So we would need this in the login component. We need our router object so that we can route the users. We need the activated route so that we can get the last visited route of the user. We need the form builder to build our form. We have a form group, so we would need this. And we need the toast surface to show some notifications to our users. Okay, so now this is what we will need in the constructor. Now we will also need a package to be installed in our application to manage state of the user. So whether the user is logged in, it's not logged out, we will use this package to know and manage the state of our user. So it's a very light library and we are going to use it. So we would be installing a library called as code with Dan observable store. It's a simple library created by Dan to manage state in Angular applications, and it can also be used with React and Vue or any other framework, JavaScript framework. So if you look at the diagram over here, you will notice that if you have multiple services, you basically have one store which will save the state in your application, and all your services will communicate with that particular store and fetch the details about the state and then send it back to the component. Instead of managing state in individual services, Dan has created an observable store which manages the state in your application. So the diagram is pretty straightforward, can be understood by anyone who is familiar with the Angular's service and component based structure. Here we just have an additional part which is an observable store which will manage the state in our application. The library is very easy to use. All we have to do is extend our service or the class that we want to use the state management with the observable store, and then add the required states using the different methods which I will show you when we implement it in our application. But we will be using this particular library. You can follow him on GitHub as well as I'll add the links in the video description. He's an author at Pluralsight, so you can follow him there. I have watched his videos at Pluralsight as well. Pretty much up to date with Angular. There are videos on Pluralsight which he has published and which I have watched. So if you want to follow him, you can also follow him at Pluralsight. He's an author at Pluralsight, and there are many other people that you can follow who are very familiar and up to date with what's going on in Angular. One of them is Deborah Kurata. So I recommend you to follow these people if you are someone who is working with Angular, and you will be notified with a lot of updates when you follow these people on Angular, on Pluralsight, on Twitter, on their Twitter handles. So we'll be using Dan's library here in our application to manage state, and you can also see that there are weekly downloads of around 1600 users weekly download this library and use it in the application. Also with the latest update, we can also use this package with Redux Dev tools, so you can do a lot of testing, and you can use it with Redux Dev tool to see your state management, how the state works in your application. Although we would not be using Redux Dev tool, but yes, with the new update you can see that it's part of the package. So go through the documentation. If you need more information, I will leave the links in the video description. So since we need to manage state in our application, where once the user logs in, we need to save that particular state somewhere in our application, we will be using this observable store for that purpose. So let's go ahead and install the code with Dan observable store library in our application. For that, we will open our terminal window, and then we will type in the following command, which is npm install the name of the library which we want to install, which in our case is @code with Dan /observable store. So I'm going to install this library now. So the library is installed. Let's go ahead and set up this library in our account service so that we can use it and we will create the methods that we would need to manage the state. So in our account service, as you can see, we first need to uh, create in the constructor, need to add the settings for the observable store and extend the uh, class with observable store. So let's go ahead and do that. So to set up our observable store, all we have to do is extend our account service or the service that you want to use the state management with the observable store class. We will import it from the library we just installed. Then we are going to create an interface which will have all the properties for our state management. So I have created a interface called as store state, and I have added it to the interface folder. Here in the store state interface, I have added only one property, which is logged in status, which is of type Boolean, which will save the state as true or false for the logged in user status. Next thing that I go back to the account service, here you will see we have an error. That's because we have to add the super method inside the constructor in order to specify the settings for the observable store. It requires us to pass this to the base of the constructor of observable store. So now we would need to add this over here in our constructor. So let's go ahead and add the super method. In the super method, we are going to specify the settings that we need for our observable store. So here, as soon as I put an object, you will notice that the error is disappeared. Here you can set different settings for your state management. So the settings that we will use is the log state changes and track state history. Here I have set both these values to false. If I set both these values to true, so your state will be tracked and the state of the uh, in our application will be logged in the console. So every time in your application console, you will see the state being logged. And if you don't want that, then you can change this to false like I have did in this particular account service. I will set it to true while we are testing the logged in status of the user, so we can see how it's logged in our console. But for now I have set it to false, and here after we have set the settings to false, we need to add the state of the user logged in status. So I will go ahead and create a login status observable of type behavior subject. Here I've initialized the value of this behavior subject to this method I have created over here. It's an extension method that I'm using. So here what this method does, it checks in the cookies of the browser if we have any cookie with the name of login status, and if it does find any cookie with the name of login status, it's going to return true. If it's going to not find anything, then it's going to return false. So when we save the login status, we will save it as 1 or 0 in the cookie service or in the cookie. So 1 basically means true and 0 means false. So anything other than 1 will be returned as false. So here the value will be stored as Boolean. So in the constructor, we have to initialize the state of the login status. So the initial state that we want to set. So the initial state will be set based on the value of the behavior subject that we have added over here. So we in order to get the value from this behavior subject, we have to subscribe to it. So we subscribe to that behavior subject object, and then we return the result, which will be then set to the login status. That is the value or the property that we have in our store. So we have set the value of this login status property in our store to the value that we receive from the behavior subject. And here we can set a message for the state, and the message that I have set over here is login status. So this particular state is reference to our login status of the user. So I have set the message as login status. So if there's any other state that you are trying to add to your store, so this particular string should represent what exactly that state is for. So in my case, it's regarding the login status of the user. So I have put the string as logged in status. You can use any string over here that you feel represents your particular state. It doesn't have to match what I have over here. So you can use any string that you feel once again represents your state. So in this case, this particular string represents the login status. So I have added it over here. So that's it. We have initialized the state now. So we have set our observable store. We should not see any errors. Now we have to go ahead and log in our users. Once the user is logged in, then we can update this particular state in our observable store based on the observable store's state that is returned to us. We can set or hide the components in our application, Angular application. So I'll show you how to do that, but first we need to add our login method so that it can go ahead and communicate with the auth endpoint we have created in the account controller. So let's go ahead and create this login method. Just before I create the login method, also if you want to test if your observable store is working and it's tracking the state, what you can do is you can set the values to true for the track history and log state changes. Once you set it to true, if you go to your login component, you will notice that the state changes are being logged in your console. So right now you can see the state of login status is false and the caller is your account service, as you can see, and we have the action name that we have specified over here as login status. So this is how we can log the different states in our application if we set the values to true. Since I don't want to clutter the console, so I have changed it back to false. But yes, if you want to test and see if your observable store is working as expected, you could do this and you could print it on your console. So we have in our login component this error to fix. We will fix this. But yes, now let's first go ahead and create the login method so that we can communicate with the backend. So here I have created a login method. The login method will require 3 parameters. One is the username, second the password, and third the remember me flag, which is true or false. Here in the login method, first thing we are going to check if there is an active two-factor session in process for the user. Now what do I mean by active session? So to explain what I mean, I'm going to go to the finished project over here. Here I'm going to log in. So I have my two-factor authentication on. So when I log in, I should be asked for a two-factor code. As you can see that I'm being asked for a two-factor authentication code because my two-factor authentication is on. But for some reason I go back to the login page while my session is active and I try to log in again. Here you will notice there is a pop-up which will tell me that previous session is already active. Do I need to end that previous session? And I'll have an option to end it, or I'll have an option to cancel this particular pop-up. So that's what I'm trying to implement over here. First thing in the login process, since we are going to implement two-factor authentication, we need to check if there is an active session going on. And if there is an active session, then we should first end that active session before we make another request to log in our application. So when we hit the end session, we will do certain processes that is required to end this session and create a new session, which I will explain when we are working on the login method. But for now, just for the demo purposes, I'm going to end this session. And once I end this session, my page is supposed to refresh. Once it is refreshed, I should be able to log in. And I should see another authentication code page over here, two-factor code that I need to enter without any pop-up because I ended the previous session. So we are going to implement that in our login process. So therefore we have to check if we have an session active. So we are going to add the check over here. So we are going to store a flag in our local storage called as is session active. So we're going to get that value from the local storage and then validate based on the value we receive from the local storage. So here, as you can see, I've added a if else block. In the if condition, I'm checking if the value of our is session active variable is 0, 1, is 0, undefined, or not equal to 1. In that specific case, we know that this session is not active. Therefore, we will go ahead and implement the logic to log in the user. And if the session is active, as you saw in the example demo that I showed you, we will load a pop-up using Sweet Alert. We will show the message, the icon, and then we will have to clear the session if the user selects end session. Here, when we clear the session, we have to send an expiry notification for the session to our backend so we can clear all the codes that were generated, which we will be implementing when we implement the two-factor authentication in our application. As we know, for now in this login method for this particular process, we are not implementing the two-factor authentication. So our condition, else condition, is not going to be executed unless we have this particular feature in place. So now we know that only the if block will be executed because we don't have any session active. We are not going to have any session active. So let's implement our logic over here. So here inside the if condition, the first thing that I have set over here is the grant type. I have set it to password. If you go to the auth service, in the auth service, we have two particular conditions or scenarios over here when the user is calling this auth method. One is when it's requesting a refresh token, one when it's requesting a new authentication token because the user is logging in for the first time. And when they are logging in for the first time, the grant type will be password, and if it's a refresh token request, the grant type will be refresh underscore token. So in the Angular code over here, we have set the grant type as password. Next thing that we have done over here, we have created a login model. In this login model, we have added the following properties. The login model here, if we go to the top of our particular class, you will see that I have created certain objects. One of them is the login model, which is of object type login. It's an interface that I have created inside the interface folder called as login.ts. Here in the interface, we have the following properties: username, password, remember me, and the grant type, which we are going to send to the backend API call. In the account service, when we go back to the method over here, after we have created the login model which we want to send to our API, we are going to make the HTTP request. Our request type is post, and we are using the HTTP object, HTTP client object that we have instantiated in the constructor of our application to make HTTP requests. Now the HTTP has the post request method where we are passing the base URL which we want to access. So in this case, the base URL, I have assigned the value over here to an object called as base URL auth, and we are calling the authentication API that we created in the previous video tutorial. Once we have passed the value over here, next we will pass the objects that we want to pass. In this particular case, it is the username, password, the remember me flag, and the grant type. You can pass the entire object or you can pass the values individually. The next thing that I have done over here is added the headers. In the headers of the HTTP request, I have added the content type, the authentication to be true, which is no authentication to be true because there is no authentication token, so I have used this flag. This flag at this point has no meaning because we have not used it yet in our application, but we will be using it very soon when we implement further functionality in this Angular application. At that point, when we make the calls, we would want to know if we want to attach tokens or not to our API endpoint calls. In this particular scenario, when the user is logging in, we don't need to attach any authentication token. So we will be needing this flag in some future methods that we will be using, but get into the habit of adding a flag like that to your HTTP calls. Next is our XSRF token, which we use to prevent forgery attacks. So that we are going to attach from the cookie service so that we can make the request, because we have set the auto validate anti-forgery tokens in our API endpoint to be true. We have this attribute. Therefore, if you don't attach the anti-forgery token, then you would not be able to make the HTTP post request. Next, let's go back over here. Once we receive the result or the response, we are going to pipe that response. In the pipe method, as I explained previously, that we can call multiple methods in a sequence. The first method in the sequence is to map the result. And here, before sending the result to the login component, because the login component, the user is going to click the login button or the button to submit the login form, then we have to send back the response back to the login component. So before sending the response back to the login component, we need to add certain values to the state, which we have done over here. Now we have created a state management for the logged in status of the user, and we are doing it through this behavior subject object, which is login status. At the moment, the login status is false. I had showed you in the console. The value is false. The initial value is false. So once the user is logged in, we have to change this value to true. Therefore, for a behavior subject to set the value, we are going to call the .next method and pass the actual value. Now the value here is going to be true. So I have passed it true. Our behavior subject is a Boolean object type. So we have to pass a Boolean type over here, which is true. Next, I'm going to set the username of the user. So username and user role, both of these objects I have created over here as behavior subject, and I have added them over here on the top. Behavior subject, initially I have set the value to be fetched from the cookie service. So when the account service is initialized for the first time, the values will be fetched from the cookie service. If it can't find a value, it will set it as null. So here we will update the values once the user logs in. So we will set the values. So that's what I have done over here. Next thing that we want to do is, after we have set the values that we need on our state and the properties like username and user role. These values, as you can see, we are getting them from the cookie service. One more point to note over here is, you will be wondering where these values, how does the cookie service know that this value is over here? If you have not watched the previous video tutorial, in the auth service, when we generate the tokens, we set the values in the cookie before sending the response back to the user. For example, as you can see in this generate new token method, before we send the response back to the user, we are setting these values here in the cookie. You can see it over here: access token, refresh token, login status, username, user role. These are the keys to access the values of these cookies. So, and we have set them as HTTP secure as false, which means our JavaScript can access these cookies. So in our Angular app, our JavaScript is accessing these cookies by the keys that we have set. So in case if you don't know how these values appear in the browser and you have not watched the previous tutorial, this is what it does, and this is how it receives the value. So we have set these values. Next thing that we want to do is get the user's profile, because now the user is logged in, we need to get their profile details, and therefore we are going to call this method called as get user profile. This is another method, extension method that I have added over here. The response type will be observable, but here I have not yet implemented this method. We are going to do that soon. And you will notice I have used toPromise over here. That's because I want to wait for this particular call to or method call to be ended before I go back and send the result. If I do an observable type over here, I don't do a promise, then I would not be able to wait for the result. Instead, the code will move on to the return result, and the result will be returned back to our login component without this particular user profile being fetched. So I want to wait till the user profile is fetched. So I am converting this to a promise, and once we have the result, then I will go ahead and return the result. So I want this call to complete before I return the result. All I'm doing here is after the call is completed is console. I'm just logging this call as user profile fetched on the console. So I'm not going to use the data what is returned, but I'm just waiting for this profile call to be completed. Here we are going to add this logic to get the user profile, and I'm going to show you what we are going to do with that profile details. But this is what we need to do. We need to fetch the user's profile before we return the result. So that is it for the login method. We don't have to do anything else. We have done the implementation over here. Only thing that is remaining is the send expiry notification, which I told you guys when we are implementing the two-factor authentication, we are going to do this. But now we are going to create this get user profile method so that we can get the details of the user. So let's implement this method. So here we have implemented the get user profile method, which is returning an observable type, and then we are converting that result to promise so that we can wait for it. But here in the get user profile method, as you see, I have added a params variable over here, which is of type HTTP params. That's because we need to add the username to our endpoint. If we go back to our application's backend code, here we have already created a controller called as profile controller in our APIs, which we have used in the admin panel to get user profiles. In the profile controller, we have an HTTP GET method called as the get user profile, which fetches the user's profile information based on the provided username in the route of the request. So here we are not passing this value in the body of our request, but we are passing it in the route of the request. And to attach this value to the route from our Angular application, we are going to use the HTTP params object. We are going to import HTTP params from HTTP common, and so that if you cannot add it with Angular's IntelliSense, you can manually add the module over here or class over here in the import statement. Next thing, once we have created the params object, we will set the key username and the value for that key as the value that we receive from the behavior subject object. The username behavior subject object which we have created, once the user logs in, we have set the value over here on that specific behavior subject object. So in order to get the value of a behavior subject object, we have a get value method inside the behavior subject which is available to us. We can call that method, and this method will return the current value of the behavior subject. Here we are checking if this params, if it has a value for the key username. If the value is not equal to null, which means we can make the request to our backend. If the value is null, then we cannot make a request to our backend because we don't know which user's profile information to be fetched. Therefore, now when we check we have a value, we have created a observable object called as profile details. If I scroll up here, you will see that this object is created over here, and I've created another object called as email to store the email of the logged in user. But here this profile detail object is of type observable. If you have watched my previous video tutorial where we set up the country service, in the country service I had explained to you guys that while switching components, we don't want to make multiple calls to our backend API. Therefore, once we fetch the result of the API call, we will store it in an observable object, and then we can share replay that same result. It's a way to cache the result in the browser. In the share replay, you will have the options to set the memory size, the time how long you want to store the cache and so on. But in this particular scenario, we are not setting those flags. We just want to cache the values that we receive from the API endpoint call. While making the API endpoint call, we need to provide the endpoint in the HTTP GET method. So we have added that endpoint over here called as users get profile, and we have passed that object to this get method, and then we have concatenated the username. In the params, we have added the params over here, and that should be it for the request. Next thing that we want to do is we will go ahead, and once we get the response, we will share replay the response. And when we have the response, if we have a result, we will set the value of the email behavior subject, and if we don't, we will return a observable error. So in an event where the username is equal to null, we are going to redirect the user back to the login page, and we are going to return an observable error. So very pretty straightforward method over here. Here you will notice that I have used the params. If you don't want to use the params, you can concatenate the username like this in the request, or you can just add it to the params. It's up to you. I have added both over here. It doesn't matter. But yes, if you just want to pass it over here, you can pass it over here, or you can add it to the params as well. Also, you can use params if you wished to pass some other values to the HTTP endpoint call. In this particular case, I'm passing it over here as well as on the route. So the choice is up to you. So I've shown you both the ways over here. So that should be it for the get user profile method. So I'm going to save this file now. Now we have completed the login method. Now we need to call this login method from our login component.ts, which we will do in the next video tutorial. That will be the final part of the video tutorial for setting up the login functionality in our application, and then we can test the login functionality in the next video as well. So if you have any questions, use the comment section, and if you want the source code will be available in the DevOps repo. The link will be provided in the video description. If if you have any questions, use the comment section, and do not forget to like and subscribe our channel Tech Howdy. Thank you once again.